Hi guys, I'm going to do a read aloud on my computer, and it's going to be chapter by chapter. Did a little bit of a practice session on Zoom with some kids, and some people said they've read this book. It's one of my favorites. I read it every spring to my kiddos. So if you've read it, great, you'll know about it. If you haven't read it, you'll get to listen to it. And if you have read it before, it's so funny that you're gonna catch things that you maybe didn't catch before. Okay, so the book is called put it up here. Sideways Story from Wayside School, and it's pretty funny. So I'm gonna make a read aloud, and I'm gonna read it like a chapter or two a day. So the introduction. This book contains 30 stories about the children and teachers at Wayside School. But before we get to know them, there's something you ought to know so that you don't get confused. Wayside School was accidentally built sideways. It was supposed to only be 1 story high with 30 classrooms all in a row. Instead, it's 30 stories high with 1 classroom on each floor. The builder said he was very sorry. Let's just kind of look at that for a minute. So the school was supposed to be 1 floor high with 30 classrooms. So kind of like that. Okay? The doors being something like that. I don't know. Kind of a fast drawing. So it's supposed to be like that, 1 story high and 30 classrooms. But instead, the builder made a mistake. And now it's this way. It's 30 stories high. That would be huge. The children at Wayside School like having a sideways school. Then they have an extra large playground. So if it was like this would be the playground, like right here and right here. But with their school being like this, their playground is, wrong way, all of this. So lots and lots of playground. That would be kind of cool. Okay. The children and teachers described in this book all go to class on the top floor. So there are 30 stories from the 30th floor of Wayside School. It has been said that these stories are strange and silly. That's probably true. However, when I told stories about you to the children at Wayside, they thought you were strange and silly. That's probably true too. So chapter 1, Mrs. Gorf. There's only one picture per chapter. It's at the beginning, so there's a picture of Mrs. Gorf. Mrs. Gorf has a long tongue and pointed ears. She was the meanest teacher in Wayside School. She taught the class on the 30th floor. If children are bad, she warned, or if you answer a problem wrong, I'll wiggle my ears, stick out my tongue, and turn you into apples. Mrs. Gorf didn't like children, but she loved apples. Joe couldn't add. He couldn't even count, but he knew that if he answered a problem wrong, he would be turned into an apple. So he copied from John. He didn't like to cheat, but Mrs. Gorf had never taught him how to add. One day, Mrs. Gorf caught Joe copying John's paper. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left. Then she stuck out her tongue and turned Joe into an apple. Then she turned John into an apple for letting Joe cheat. Hey, that's not fair, said Todd. John was only trying to help a friend. Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left one, and stuck out her tongue. And she turned Todd into an apple. Does anyone else have an opinion? She asked. Nobody said a word. Mrs. Gorf laughed, ha 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 ha, and placed the 3 apples on her desk. Stephen started to cry. He couldn't help it. He was scared. I don't allow crying in the classroom, said Mrs. Gorf. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left one, stuck out her tongue, and turned Stephen into an apple. For the rest of the day, the children were absolutely quiet. And when they went home, they were too scared to talk even to their parents. But Joe, John, Todd, and Stephen couldn't go home. Mrs. Gorf just left them on her desk. They were able to talk to each other, but they didn't have much to say. Their parents were very worried. They didn't know where their children were. Nobody seemed to know. The next day, Kathy was late for school. As soon as she walked in, Mrs. Gorf turned her into an apple. Paul sneezed during class. He was turned into an apple, too. Nancy said, God bless you, when Paul sneezed. Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left one, stuck out her tongue, and turned Nancy into an apple. Terence fell out of his chair. He was turned to an apple. Mauricia tried to run away. She was halfway to the door when Mrs. Gorf's right ear began to wiggle. When she reached the door, Mrs. Gorf's left ear wiggled. Mauricia opened the door and had one foot outside when Mrs. Gorf stuck out her tongue, and Mauricia became an apple. Mrs. Gorf picked up the apple from the floor, put it on her desk with the others. Then a funny thing happened. Mrs. Gorf turned around and fell over a piece of chalk. The three Erics laughed. They were turned into apples. Mrs. Gorf now had a dozen apples on her desk. Joe, John, Todd, Stephen, Kathy, Paul, Nancy, Terence, Mauricia, and the three Erics, Eric Fry, Eric Bacon, and Eric Evans. Louis, the yard teacher, walked into the classroom. He'd missed the children at recess. He had heard that Mrs. Gorf was a mean teacher, so he came up to investigate. He saw the 12 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. I must be wrong, he thought. She must be a good teacher if so many children bring her apples. He walked back down to the playground. The next day, a dozen more children returned into apples. Louis, the yard teacher, came back up to the room. He saw 24 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. There were only 3 children left in class. She must be the best teacher in the world, he thought. By the end of the week, all the children were apples. Mrs. Gorf was very happy. Now I can go home, she said. I don't have to teach anymore. I won't have to walk up the 30 flights of stairs ever again. You're not going anywhere, shouted Todd. He jumped off the desk and bopped Mrs. Gorf on the nose. The rest of the apples followed. Mrs. Gorf fell on the floor, and the apples jumped all over. Stop, she shouted, or I'll turn you into applesauce. But the apples didn't stop, and Mrs. Gorf could do nothing about it. Turn us back into children, Todd demanded. Mrs. Gorf had no choice. She stuck out her tongue, wiggled her ears, this time her left one first, and then her right one, and turned the apples back into children. All right, said Mauricia. Let's go get Louis. He'll know what to do. No, screamed Mrs. Gorf. I'll turn you back to apples. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left one, and stuck out her tongue. But Jenny held up a mirror, and Mrs. Gorf turned herself into an apple. The children didn't know what to do. They didn't have a teacher. Even though Mrs. Gorf was mean, they didn't think it was right to leave her as an apple. But none of them knew how to wiggle their ears. Louis, the yard teacher, walked in. Where's Mrs. Gorf? He asked. Nobody said a word. Boy, am I hungry, said Louis. I don't think Mrs. Gorf would mind if I ate this apple. After all, she always has so many. He picked up the apple, which was really Mrs. Gorf, shined it on his shirt, and ate it. And guess what? I can wiggle my ears. Can you see that? Stay tuned for part 2.